Grambling State, that is how you make an NCAA tournament debut, knocking off Montana State in epic fashion. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make it Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day, every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. And are you the type of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure is around the next corner? Then take the Nissan Rogue, Pathfinder, or Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. We wrap up with a guest. We have Isaac Schade from Locked On College Basketball to come in and break down the 4 HBCUs and why they got the seeding that they did. I just wanted to understand the whole art of the process and how we got to the final results. But we kick it off with a fantastic comeback in Grambling State in their first ever NCAA tournament, had a comeback victory. And it was one that I'm going to be honest with you. I know there was a lot of people who are going ahead and checking, all right, Purdue versus Montana State. That's what we're going to have. But then Grambling, with about halfway through, I'll probably say halfway through the second half, that's when they really began to make that comeback. Because I'm one of those people who I was starting to lose a little hope. It wasn't going well for Grambling. Things weren't falling. It felt like they were missing things that they should have been making. It was one of those days, kind of similar to Howard, where it just felt as if that was supposed to drop. And when you have enough moments where you feel like that's supposed to drop and it doesn't, you begin to lose a little hope. But your confidence begins to drop, to be honest. And that's how I personally felt. But I kept watching. We kept tuning in. And once Grambling finally hit that corner, because there was times when they looked like they were about to hit the corner, they got a lead. But once they hit that corner, there was no looking back. It was an incredible comeback. It was one people texting my phone asking if I'm watching the game. Of course I'm watching the game. Come on. I'm Mr. Locked On HBCU. I'm the Mouth of the South. Of course I'm catching this game, because Grambling, for a team who had never been in this position before, for a team who just won their first SWAC tournament, they didn't seem like the lights were too big, because when the moment got the brightest, that's when they performed the best. Specifically, Kofor. This was, for me, this was a game of unsung heroes. And that really could be the story of Grambling's SWAC tournament finals, and then also in their NCAA tournament first 4. This time it was Kofor who came off the bench, and he dropped 19 points. Most times in these games, you're looking at a Tremichael Moten, looking at a Kentavious Dozier. Like, that's who you're looking at to come in and steal the show. And I'll give it to Moten. Moten did add 6 assists to his game today, and he also did the same thing as far as making sure he facilitated the offense in the SWAC tournament finals. So when the shot wasn't dropping for him, you did have that. But the truth of the matter is, in these last 2 games, Grambling has not had their stars be the one who were the stars of that particular game. In this one, it was Kofor, who came off of the bench, dropped 19 points. The man hadn't dropped 19 points all year long. When I say this was the unlikeliest of heroes that you could have had, I would have given you 3 to 5 guesses, legitimately. If I would have given you 3 to 5 guesses on who would be the catalyst for a comeback, if I would have gave you 3 to 5 guesses on who was going to be the player of the game, I don't think you would have got Jamel Cofer. But that's what it was. He was the heartbeat on the biggest stage, a player who averages 3 points a game, came and dropped 19 his season high. That's what we call rising to the occasion. That is the type of performance that creates stars. Like, that's the type of performance that gets you noticed. And I bet you he'll have a little bit more time in the next game against Purdue. This was incredible. I want to highlight 2 plays in particular. Jordan Smith did have 18 points. He was the second leading scorer, along with Burnett, who also had 18, but Cofer ended up being the leading scorer on the day. Jordan Smith had a putback dunk that was arguably the biggest and most explosive offensive play for Grambling on the day. It genuinely was, because when he had that putback dunk, that's when I said it's Grambling's game. This was in overtime. They stormed back to make it into an overtime game. But that's when I said this is Grambling. That secured it for me. It in no way did it secure it. You'll hear this often, right? Everydayers know this. There's a lot of times that I have these conversations about basketball games. I think I do it more so basketball than football. But there's plays that make me come to a realization on what I believe the outcome is going to be. And I'll be honest with you, I'm rarely wrong in that. I don't predict games and things of that nature. But when I say that's the turning point live, my intuition is typically pretty good with that. And that's how I felt about the putback dunk, because it represented a shift. It represented a change, because they were struggling to hit close shots early in the game, but then nothing will come from it to be a rebound for Montana State. This time, it missed I wouldn't say it was an easy shot, but it was a shot in the paint. And Jordan Smith came out of nowhere with a putback dunk that was explosive. And I was watching the game and I didn't see him coming. So that's one of the things that I pointed to as a difference maker. And then the other one was a defensive play on the last offensive possession of the game. And Montana State had Brandon Walker. He was a big man who was really good. He was arguably their best player along with Ford. Those 2 players right there are 2 players who stood out to me. But Walker had this move. He would get to the right block. Yeah, he would get to the right block and he would spin inward, right? And I believe it was either Burnett. I think it was either Burnett or Aku. It was one of the 2, but I think it might have been Burnett, because I feel like I remember 4. He knew that move was coming. He would drive down and he would spin inward. And as soon as he went to spin, I'm gonna say it was Burnett. Burnett slid in with him and he beat him to that spot. Jordan Smith came and rushed on the other side. So now they had him kind of trapped, and Walker had to throw up a shot. And that was a difference, because it was a move that they were consistently hurting Grambling with. For some reason, it just felt unstoppable. Maybe it was his agility. Maybe, I don't know what it was. But they had seen it enough times that they knew when he went to this right block, he was going to try to spin towards the goal and try to get a layup with his left hand. And it was taken away. And that allowed them to take the game into overtime. It was those 2 plays right there. The stopping of Brandon Walker from a move that was very efficient for him all night. And then also the putback slam by Jordan Smith. Those are your 3 players: Burnett, Smith, Cofer. And Cofer just was the catalyst that lit everything. Now Grambling is going to play Purdue. I believe that's going to be on Friday. Yes, because today's Wednesday. So it's going to be on Friday. I'll be checking that game out. They brought some cash in. I don't know the exact figures, because it kind of goes up and fluctuates on a yearly basis. But they bringing in some. They are bringing in some cash to the SWAC, and you'll have that unit that's going to be paid out for the next 5 years. So more important than anything else, they done brought some cash to everybody else in the SWAC. So my TSU self is happy about that. As we push forward, let's see how Grambling got here. I sat down with Isaac Schade earlier, right? So I sat down with him Wednesday morning, and we had a conversation about first 4 versus just being a 16 seed. How would I put it? The ceiling for HBCUs, how it's higher for women as opposed to men. So we looked at all of those things, and I want to look at those with you as we continue with Locked On HBCU. This week's March Madness bracket is being broken down and brought to you by Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out and a team that has pushed it further than the rest. Just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs, these guys were able to take it to the next level. And I look at Grambling. I know that this isn't the one that's on the script today, but when I see what Grambling was able to do, they are very reminiscent of the Nissan Pathfinder because they've been thrilling to watch. They've created a lane for themselves, and after claiming the SWAC tournament title for the first time, they went into their first ever NCAA tournament, and they won in the round of the first four. So let's see what they can do against Purdue. Just like the new Nissan SUVs, you can never predict what is next. So take the Nissan Rogue, Pathfinder, or Armada and go find your next big adventure. If you're looking for any of those SUVs, you can find them at nissanusa.com. Looking for the Rogue, Pathfinder, or Armada, they're at nissanusa.com. Then today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. How many of you felt confident enough to put some money down on Grambling, maybe a $5 bet, whether it was a money line, maybe it was live bets, maybe when the lead or the deficit for Grambling had reached to a certain point, you still had confidence in the Tigers to come back. If any of those things happen and you put down $5 and you're new to FanDuel, then you will get $200 back in bonus bets. Maybe you didn't take your chance yet. That's okay. It's been a while. It's here for all of March Madness. And here's the beautiful part about it. Everybody looks at March Madness with the brackets, and you get to the round of maybe you get to the Elite Eight and you've been perfect, and then something breaks for you. There's no such thing as your bracket being busted at FanDuel. All you have to do is put a game-by-game basis. Go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on, and take part of the best way to make money on March Madness. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. Make every moment more. As we continue rolling with today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day. Every day for your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports today. The first of its kind, 24/7, all day, every day, live sports network on YouTube. Go to Locked On Sports today and subscribe. I have Isaac Schade with me. You may remember him. I mentioned him on Monday and Tuesday's episode as a part of Locked On College Basketball's Bracket Breakdown Show. He's also the host of Locked On Tar Heels, a basketball school, so you know that this is his favorite time of the year. I appreciate you coming on, and I want to give a baseline of information as we try to understand how the rankings in the seedings in the almost at HBCU, but in the NCAA tournament go. So the first thing is we know that Norfolk State, Howard, Jackson State, Grambling, we know that they made it as automatic qualifiers. But once you make the tournament, how does the committee decide on which teams get placed at which seeds?
That's a great question, Darian. And you're absolutely right. This is my favorite time of the year. I should be wearing my Santa hat right now because today, the first day of the tournament, is Christmas for me. I absolutely love it. So here's what the committee does. As you said, there's these automatic qualifiers. Across Division I, there are 362 teams in all of Division I, and they're in 32 different conferences. All 32 of those conferences get one of those automatic qualifying bids that you talked about. Obviously, the MEAC and the SWAC are part of that, and 30 other conferences. Each conference gets to determine how they have their automatic qualifier. For example, for a long time, the Ivy League didn't have a conference tournament. It's just whoever won the regular season got their automatic qualifier. And so you get those 32 teams, and then the selection committee, which is made up of like ADs from around the country, things like that, selects what they believe to be the next 36 best teams. That's the at-larges we hear people talk about, that bubble conversation, which would basically be teams, 34, 5, 6, 7, and then the teams just off of that, 38, 39, 40, in that range. And then once they have selected, obviously the 32 automatic qualifiers are given to them. Once they select those 36 at-larges, now they've got a pool of 68 total teams. Mm-hmm. What the selection committee then does is looks at everything they have available to them. Records, there's about 4 different websites they use, some which are predictive metrics of what a team is supposed to do, and some more results-based, what they actually have done. And they rank those 68 teams 1 through 68. In fact, I've got it pulled up right here in front of me, what just call a seed list, all the way from top to bottom. For the play-in games to be determined who goes where, what happens is there are the 4 lowest automatic qualifiers, whoever those 4 teams are determined to be, and the 4 lowest of those 36 at-large teams. Those are the 8 teams that go play in what I've started calling the slashy games instead of the play-in games.
I like it. Okay, I like it. The slashy. Okay, I had to think. I was like, why would you call it that?
Because on the bracket it's the slash. I like it.
So I do want to definitely make sure we get into the difference between a first 4, the play-in, the slashy. We got so many terms we could call it, but I want to start off. They say we gentlemen, ladies first, right? And the ladies have been more successful this year. They were able to skip over that 16 seed, with Norfolk being a 15 and Jackson State being a 14. Jackson State women's basketball is the one that really gets me, because they received a vote for the NCAA top 25. But their net ranking is 100, right? And that's not good. Which of those weighs more in the mind of committees? Because I would think that a team that was top 25, or got a vote for the top 25 would be higher than 14.
Yep. So here's the deal with the top 25 voting. That is done by a group of basketball, or I shouldn't even say basketball, from sports writers from around the country that the AP selects. There's usually about 68 of them, and they all just vote, make a top 25 every single week, and then that drops on Mondays. That top 25, I'll just say that some of the voters are really dialed in and great, and some are not. And I'm not saying that whoever voted for Jackson State is not dialed in. I'm just saying that it's often less metrics based, or often has less careful attention paid to it. And so a lot of times, like what people will do is you'll see them give votes to a team, like on the men's side, South Florida found their way into the top 25, not even just getting a vote, but like was top 25 nationally. And it was more just like a prestige thing rather than them deserving to be there, because they were not one of the 25 best teams on the men's side of the game. And so, frankly, South Florida should have never been in the top 25, but it was a way for some of the AP voters to recognize what they had done. So the selection committee is not putting any stock into what we see in the AP top 25 poll, or even in the others receiving votes, like where Jackson State would have landed. They're more looking at a certain set of data from other things outside of the AP. So we have to keep those two things, the AP poll and what the selection committee is doing, separate.
So realistically, because we speak about the net rankings, and I know that Jackson State's and Norfolk State, because Norfolk is at 122 on the women's side, right, both had fantastic records. And I mean, just period, not just in conference, but fantastic records all the way through.
Right.
What needs to happen? Or not even what needs to happen. I know what needs to happen. What's the likelihood of HBCUs getting above 14, above 13? Like, what is the likelihood of that being? What's the likelihood of 14 not being the ceiling for HBCUs as what it's been recently?
That's a great question. I think it is more likely on the women's side, and we can get to the men's side, but the women have a better opportunity. Like Jackson State, as you were talking about, Darren, they just got it absolutely, like, it's just rolling right now. You know what Tamika Reed's got going on there? What is it, 5 straight regular seasons now? I mean, it's insane what they're doing in the SWAC. You love to see it. But what has to happen is you just got to keep building that culture. Like, for example, you talked about the wins and losses. One of the issues is that a lot of, like, for example, Jackson State is going to keep winning, but they're going to have a harder time scheduling the teams at the very tip top of the sport in the ACC and the Big East and these other programs and in the SEC, because they're like, oh, Jackson State is legit. we don't want that on our resume if they should beat us, right? If they come to Columbia, South Carolina and knock us off, ooh, right? And so that's one of the big things that mid-major teams struggle with on both the women's and men's side, is getting big boy teams, big girl teams to allow them to have a game. And it's not just about wins and losses. That's the problem, is the committee's looking at who are all those teams. So for example, Wagner, who won the first play-in game for the men, and I know they're not one of the HBCUs that we're talking about, but just use them as an example. They only have 2 Power 6 conference teams on their resume this year, Providence and Seton Hall. Those were the only 2 power major conference teams they were able to play, and literally everyone else on their resume is outside the top 2 quadrants. All like 21 of their games have been in quad 4 this year, which is the lowest ranking of game. And so beyond just wins and losses, the committee is looking at who did you play. And my frustration on behalf of these HBCU schools and other strong mid-majors is a lot of times these higher rated teams won't give them a game. And so there's got to be a way to do that. Like I loved that on the men's side, the Pac-12, and was it Pac-12 and SWAC that has
Yes.
right? Like I love the Pac-12 for doing that. That to me is awesome. And you saw what happened, right? The SWAC went in and won multiple of those games last year. That was great. Unfortunately, the Pac-12 is now dissolving. So what we need to happen is to have some of these Power 6 conferences be willing to take those games. And I think that's going to help raise the profile and raise the resume that these schools have. The women, like you said, Jackson State, killing it. Norfolk State, killing it. And you just got to keep finding ways to crack the door and then slam your way through it once you find that crack.
You just gave me an idea. Sometime next week, you'll see a conversation on Locked On HBCU about the Pac-12 SWAC challenge and expanding that and the dissolving of the conference. Because I didn't even think about the impact. I'm a football guy, so
right,
mentally, I'm like, oh, Pac-12 is done. That's crazy. Power 4 now, but that's a good idea. I'm gonna make sure I write that in my notes for next week's line of topics. But let's move over to the men's side. I have another kind of broad question about the process before we get specifically into Howard and Grambling as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV, and I hope that's what you were watching the Grambling versus Montana State game on last night, because this game was perfect. You could have watched Jordan Smith's amazing putback dunk on the big screen. And I love these things. I got my remote in front of me yet again. This is not a game. Y'all see it. I love the beautiful display, the ease of the remote, the apps on the bottom. All of these things are amazing. But let's say you don't have a Fire TV, but you have a smart TV. Then you can still get the Fire Stick. And when you get the Fire Stick, you can just go ahead and plug it in. It's like you have a Fire TV. And no matter if you have the TV or the stick, you can still use the Fire TV channels. And that'll have your biggest brands, including Locked On, the NCAA, the MLB. All of these things are here at your fingertips. All you have to do is pick up this here remote that I love showing you and go to Amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV to learn more and get a remote of your own. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day, every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. I have Isaac Schade of Locked On College Basketball and Locked On Tar Heels with me. We're breaking down the view of the NCAA tournament and the relationship that they have with HBCUs. But let's kind of expand that away from just HBCUs to many mid-majors. When you're looking at the committee, what is the view of the mid-major conference? Not just the winners, but the majority of mid-major conferences, because from my point of view, I find it really unfair that you have to beat 3, 4 top 10, top 15 teams in the country, then go undefeated in your conference because it's not overly respected as far as net ranking. So too many losses, 2, 3, 4 losses in a conference is going to knock you down significantly. I find it unfair that you have to be nearly perfect and excel in 3 huge games a season just to get a 12 seed. So what's the view of these mid-majors?
Yeah, I think you're right with that, Darian. One of the things that the committee often does is struggles to understand how to appropriately value mid-major and low-major teams. They struggle because they don't see them playing some of the bigger schools from the SEC or Big 10 or Big 12. And as we just talked about a minute ago, a lot of times it's because those teams won't schedule them. So it's this frustrating, like you're banging your head against a wall kind of moment. And what we often see then is it's not shocking to me when some of these teams from mid-major conferences will knock off some of these other schools. And it's like, well, yeah, because parity in college basketball is better than ever. As we get players spreading around, like, I don't want to go sit on Kentucky's bench, not playing as like the 9th or 10th guy. So I'm going to go somewhere where I can play. So what that means then is that the selection committee needs to continue to figure out better ways to evaluate who these teams are and what they are, even when they're not able to, play all the biggest names in the sport. Let's use FAU, Florida Atlantic, as an example. And I know they're, kind of at the upper echelon of mid-major, but I use them as an example because they made it all the way to the Final Four last year, kind of unexpectedly, but had a great run, had a marvelous season. As you talked about some of those losses, only had, I believe it was 2 losses heading into postseason play. This year, because they brought all of those players back, they've been under a microscope all year long. And every little chink in the armor, people see that and they're like, oh, FAU ain't it anymore. And it's like, well, they're under a completely different set of expectations now because of what they did last year. And so it's just not fair to them because there is this pressure of like, oh my, we can't slip up a single time and we're so stressed in every game. And that ain't it, my dude. And so that's part of what we got to figure out is how to allow these teams to get better games and to be more fairly evaluated or appropriately evaluated, I guess, at the same time by the selection committee.
Yes, and I want to. So we're now on to the men's, right? And Grambling and Howard were the 2 people who made it from the men's side, and they both were in the first 4. Now I understand that the first 4 is the last 4 qualifying, the 68 to 65, right? 8,
right,
7,
exactly,
65.
exactly.
Okay, I understand that, but what is the separation in that process between 68 to 65 and then 64 to 60? Like, is it a small margin of a difference? Is it a big difference? What's so basically between the teams that are guaranteed at 16 and the teams who are in the first 4, what's the difference in that group?
That's a great question. So let's go with Stetson, who was number 64. They're out of the Atlantic Sun Conference. Quite frankly, I thought they should should have been 65 instead of Montana State out of the Big Sky. And then after that was Grambling State, Howard, Wagner. That was the order of 65 to 68. And so, it sometimes is a thin margin there, but like, for example, Longwood, St. Peter's, South Dakota, those were the teams 63, 62, South Dakota State, I should say 61. And you start to get a little more separation there as you look at it. But, it is. Unfortunately, when you look at Grambling and Howard, Grambling 279 in the net, Howard 273, and then Wagner, because they were that surprise out of the Northeastern Conference, was the 6th seed, so they were even lower, 290. So that's why they're 68 in this whole thing. But from Grambling up to Montana State, who was 65, Montana State was 208 in the net. So from 208 down to Grambling at 279 is a pretty big margin. Stetson, 209. So they were just right there in that same thing as well. Let's take, for example, Norfolk State, who to me has been the class of the MEAC all season long. Preseason, they were my far and away pick to win both the conference regular season and tournament. Unfortunately, got picked off, as we know, by Howard in the conference tournament. Even if Norfolk State had made it in, they still probably would have been, I think, team 66, I think I probably would have said. So just basically switched with Grambling. They were right. I checked just before we hopped on, 238 at KenPom, 223 in the net. So much closer to Montana State at 65, but still, 15-ish slots behind them and would have been in that play-in game, but with a much better shot at winning it. And as you and I talked about last year, how critically important every win is because of those NCAA tournament units and the money that would have brought in to the MEAC conference.
Yes, and we're recording this before Grambling plays, so my fingers are crossed as a SWAT guy
That's
that
right.
Grambling can go ahead and bring some money on to the conference. Isaac Schade, best in the business, right? Got to check out Locked On College Basketball, Locked On Tar Heels. These will be some very important podcasts during the month of March, specifically Locked On College Basketball, because no matter what happens at North Carolina, that show will still be going until the tournament is over. So make sure you check out him and Andy on Locked On College Basketball, breaking down all the brackets so that you can make sure that you pick the right teams. I appreciate you for coming on. I appreciate you for listening. And until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.